My wife cheated on me and ended up in the hospital. Everyone asks me to forgive her, but my decision to leave her is irrevocable. My life, until recently, was gliding along the tracks of normality, that daily routine that is sometimes appreciated and other times feels monotonous, but which at the end of the day was my reality. At 37 years old, married to my wife, also of the same age, we shared a house, memories, and a life built over many years. We were a marriage with the typical ups and downs, but we had always known how to pull together, overcome obstacles, and move forward. Our twin children, all grown up at 19 and in college, were our pride, the tangible proof that we had done something right in this world. Every day was another piece of the same puzzle: established routines, jobs, dinners, conversations about daily life, nothing out of the ordinary. Even when my wife announced she had a 2-day work trip, we took it with the usual naturalness: a farewell kiss in the morning, a have a good trip, and each of us to our responsibilities. The day passed without incident. At the office, everything was as usual. Upon returning home, I made myself dinner, quietly enjoying the silence her absence left, a silence that would soon turn unsettling. I was finishing dinner when the phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. "Hello," I answered in a relaxed tone, expecting the typical conversation about how her day was going. But her voice on the other end of the line was shaky, broken. You have to come to the hospital quickly," she managed to say with difficulty. My heart leaped. What is wrong? What happened? The tranquility of a few moments ago dissipated at once, replaced by a cold anguish. It is your wife. She is in the hospital. Something very bad has happened." Her voice broke, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Confusion overwhelmed me. The hospital? My wife was supposed to be on a trip out of town. Why was she here? And what had happened to her? 1,000 questions crowded my mind as I rose from the chair with a churning stomach and a growing sense of panic. I left the house in a hurry, with the call still active on the car's speakerphone. My mother-in-law's voice was babbling disconnected phrases, unable to give me a clear explanation. The uncertainty was a lump in my throat. A car accident? A sudden illness? The worry grew with every second as I drove as fast as I could towards the hospital, imagining terrible scenarios, praying that it was nothing serious. When I arrived, I found her in the waiting room, visibly upset. I greeted her with a quick kiss and the question that was burning on my lips. What happened? Please, tell me what happened to her. Her response was even more disconcerting. She avoided my gaze, stammered, without giving me a direct answer. Her evasive behavior, her nervousness, only increased my anxiety. Something was not right. I do not know. I really do not know for sure. I only know she is inside, the doctors. Her words were lost in a sea of tears and incomplete sentences. Impatience was eating me up inside. I needed answers, clarity. I left my mother-in-law trying to calm herself and approached the information desk. I asked about my wife. They told me to speak with the doctor in charge. The doctor received me in a small office with a serious and pained face. He explained that my wife had suffered an assault, an attack with a sharp object. He told me about several wounds, the seriousness of the initial situation, how they had managed to stabilize her. The words hit me like sledgehammers. Assault? Sharp object? I did not understand anything. Who? Why? But the most shocking part came later. The doctor, in a more confidential tone, asked for a moment alone with me in a more private place. There, with the door closed, he revealed something that left me frozen, that transformed the confusion into an even greater bewilderment and a deep unease. He told me about other signs, delicate details, signs that suggested something more, something dark, something that went beyond a simple street assault. He mentioned abuse in her private area. The world stopped for a moment. Abuse? What did all this mean? Who could have done something like that to her? Why? The image of my wife, vulnerable and injured, tore me apart inside, and the shadow of that other revelation filled me with a dark and unknown anguish. I asked the doctor about her condition, about whether she would recover. He assured me that she would, that the bleeding was controlled, that the most serious complications had been overcome. At least, within the nightmare, there was a thread of hope. I left the office with my heart in my throat, with a mixture of anger, worry, and an immense emptiness. I needed time to process everything, to understand what was happening. But one thing was clear: The quiet and routine life I knew had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. The next day, the office was the last thing on my mind. I requested a few days off from work. I needed to be at the hospital, next to my wife. Although the confusion and the doctor's dark revelations still echoed in my head, the responsibility and concern for her health, despite everything, came first. Thus began some strange days in a hospital bubble. I settled into a routine of constant visits, trying to be a support for her, although inside a whirlwind of emotions tossed me about relentlessly. I saw her physically better, recovering slowly from her wounds. I talked to her about trivial things, trying to maintain normality, although the emotional distance between us was becoming more and more palpable. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected, separating us. In those days at the hospital, I became a shadow of my former self, attentive to her needs, but distant in my feelings. I accompanied her. I brought her things. I spoke with the doctors, but I avoided delving into what had happened. The conversation about the attack, about what had really happened, was a taboo subject between us. She did not mention it either, perhaps sensing my discomfort, or perhaps she herself was avoiding reliving the trauma. One morning, while waiting in the hospital waiting room, I noticed an unusual presence. Two men dressed in suits approached the information desk and asked for my wife. Instinctively, I knew they were police officers. A pang of unease ran through my body. Police? Why would the police want to talk to her? What was really happening? I approached them with my heart pounding. "Can I help you?" I asked with a thin voice. They identified themselves as police officers and explained that they needed to talk to my wife about the incident. "It was not a simple accident, sir," one of them said in a grave tone. "There are indications that it was a provoked incident." The word incident resonated in my head, loaded with a dark and threatening meaning. "Provoked incident?" I repeated, feeling a coldness in my stomach. "What do you mean by that?" "We prefer to speak directly with your wife, sir. It is a delicate matter." His evasive answer only increased my confusion and my anguish. I waited impatiently for my wife to wake up from her morning drowsiness. When she finally opened her eyes, the police officers entered the room. I stayed outside, in the hallway, on edge, biting my nails, trying to guess what they were asking her, what they were revealing to her. The possibilities, all grim, danced in my mind like ghosts. What kind of provoked incident had she suffered? Who would want to harm her? And the shadow of the intimate abuse still loomed over everything, adding a layer of mystery and fear to the situation. The minutes passed, which felt like an eternity. From the hallway, I watched the closed door, trying to read in the police officer's body language some clue, some sign. But their faces remained impenetrable. Finally, the door opened. The police officers came out of the room and asked for a moment with me. They invited me to accompany them to a more discreet place, a small empty meeting room at the end of the hallway. There, with the seriousness that anticipated the worst, they revealed the truth to me. A truth that hit me with the force of a hurricane, that destroyed what little stability I had left, and that changed my life forever. "Sir," one of the agents began, looking me directly in the eyes, "what happened to your wife was not a random assault. It was an attack in a very different context." He paused, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps simply preparing me for the impact of what he was about to tell me. "Your wife was with another man in a motel." The words hit me like a dry blow to the chest, leaving me breathless. In a motel? With another man? My mind went blank, unable to process the information. I felt as if the floor opened up under my feet, letting me fall into a dark abyss. "It was there that she was attacked, by that man," the policeman continued. "He stabbed her repeatedly. That is the reason she is in the hospital." The room began to spin. My breathing became short. With another man? My wife cheating on me. And it had all ended in violence, in blood, in the hospital. The betrayal and the brutality were intertwined in a grotesque and painful image. The police explained the details they had been able to gather so far. The motel, the encounter, the assault, the man's escape. Everything fit. Everything was terribly real. "We understand that this is a very difficult situation, sir," the other agent said with a tone of false compassion. "We recommend that you be strong." Strong? How was I supposed to be strong in the face of such a revelation? My world had collapsed in an instant. The woman I loved, my life partner, the mother of my children, had cheated on me, had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and it had all ended in a bloodbath. The police said goodbye, leaving me alone in the meeting room with the naked and brutal truth hitting me in the face. I left the hospital like an automaton, aimlessly, with my heart in pieces and my mind flooded with unanswered questions. I needed air, I needed space, I needed time to absorb the blow. I simply needed to disappear. I left the hospital and walked aimlessly. My feet took me to a nearby park, a green space with lonely benches under the shade of the trees. I collapsed onto one of them, my gaze lost in the distance, trying to process the bomb that had just exploded in my life. Infidelity, assault, motel. The words echoed in my head, forming a bitter cocktail of betrayal and violence. The truth was a dagger stuck in my soul. The woman I thought I knew, the woman with whom I had shared so many years, had cheated on me, had humiliated me in the most painful way. And worst of all this had ended in a brutal act, in a hospital, with her life hanging by a thread. I felt a mixture of anger, pain, confusion. An immense emptiness was opening up inside me, swallowing any trace of the life I knew. On that park bench, I felt alone, abandoned to my fate, with the weight of the world on my shoulders. Tears threatened to flow, but I held them back with force, as if allowing myself to cry would make me collapse completely. I did not want to break, not now, not yet. I needed to process all this, even if my mind resisted accepting the cruel reality. It was then that I saw her approaching. My mother-in-law found me in the park. I suppose she followed me, worried about my reaction. She sat next to me on the bench, with a pained face, trying to offer comfort, although her words, from the beginning, sounded hollow and wrong. "Son, I understand you are upset. It is a shock for everyone," she began, her tone soft and maternal, which at that moment I found irritating. "But now is not the time to think about that. We have to think about your wife, about her health. That is the most important thing." I glanced at her sideways, without answering. Think about my wife after what they had just revealed to me? Her comment seemed like a bad joke to me, a display of willful blindness to the magnitude of the situation. She, perhaps interpreting my silence as receptiveness, continued trying to downplay what had happened, looking for excuses where there were none. These things happen in marriages. They are slips, mistakes, but they can be overcome. The important thing is that she recovers, that she is well again. Then there will be time to talk, to solve things. Solve? Solve what? The infidelity? The betrayal? The brutal attack? Her words sounded absurd to me, as if she were trying to convince me that all this was a simple stumble, something we could sweep under the rug and go on as if nothing had happened. The anger began to boil inside me. Anger towards my wife for her deceit, anger towards her lover for the violence, and also anger towards my mother-in-law for her attempt to minimize the unforgivable. I stood up from the bench abruptly, interrupting her in the middle of her well-intentioned but completely out-of-place speech. I looked her in the eyes for the first time since she had sat next to me, and I said with a voice I barely recognized as my own, cold and distant, "It is over." My mother-in-law looked at me with disbelief, not understanding the weight of those two words. "What is over, son? Do not talk nonsense. Think about your wife, about her condition. Do not be selfish now." Her tone rose, moving from comfort to reproach, but I was no longer willing to listen. "Everything is over," I repeated with more firmness. "There is nothing to solve. It is over." I left her in the park, with her shouts and reproaches echoing in my ears. I did not care what she thought, what she said. My decision was made. There was no going back. I returned home with the same feeling of emptiness and confusion, but now accompanied by a cold and painful determination. At home, I sought refuge in my study, that space that had always been my sanctuary, but now not even that place could offer me comfort. I opened the cabinet where I kept the liquor bottles. I had never been a regular drinker, but that night I needed to numb the pain, to drown my sorrows in alcohol. I started drinking, glass after glass, without control, without measure. The whiskey burned in my throat, but it could not extinguish the fire that was consuming me inside. I drank until my head spun, until the pain numbed, until my consciousness clouded. At some point, I collapsed on the study sofa with the half-empty bottle in my hand, plunged into a heavy and restless sleep, escaping, if only for a few hours, from the nightmare that my life had become. The next day, I woke up with a dry mouth, a throbbing head, and a feeling of emptiness even deeper than the night before. The study smelled of alcohol and desolation. My phone, on the table, was blinking with notifications, missed calls, messages. Relatives of my wife, relatives of mine, all aware, all worried, all about to arrive in the city to see how we were, to try to put back together what could not be fixed. The storm, far from abating, was just beginning to be unleashed. My body felt as heavy as lead and my head was a constant hammer. I got up from the study sofa with difficulty, feeling physically and emotionally devastated. The light of the new day filtering through the window offered no comfort, only highlighting the desolation of the environment and my own. The messages and missed calls on the phone were a persistent reminder that the outside world, with its opinions and concerns, was about to invade my bubble of pain. I tried to pull myself together as best I could. A cold shower and a strong coffee managed to clear my mind a little, although the knot in my stomach and the tightness in my chest persisted. I dressed in clean clothes, trying to project an image of control, although inside I felt completely broken. I knew that the arrival of my family and my wife's was imminent, and although I did not want to face the situation, I could not hide forever either. When my children arrived a few hours later, I was already waiting for them at home. I hugged them tightly, feeling their worry and affection as a small balm in the midst of the chaos. Their faces reflected the anguish that I also felt, but also a strength that comforted me. I took them to my study, the only place where I felt minimally comfortable, and I asked them to sit down. It was time to speak clearly, to share the truth, however painful it might be. "Children," I began, my voice still a little rough from the alcohol and lack of sleep. "I know you are worried about your mother and me, and I know that the news you have heard is complicated." My twins looked at me attentively, in silence, waiting for me to continue. I took a deep breath and told them everything. I revealed the conversation with the police, the infidelity, the motel, the attack. I explained the truth without sugarcoating the most painful details, but trying to maintain a calm and serene tone. I needed them to understand the situation, to understand the reason for my pain and the magnitude of the betrayal. They listened in silence, with pale faces and eyes full of disbelief. When I finished speaking, the silence lingered for a few moments, dense and heavy. Then my daughter, with a trembling voice, was the first to break it. "Dad, is all that true? Did Mom really do that?" I nodded slowly, my gaze lowered. "Yes, children, it is the truth." I saw tears well up in their eyes, but also an expression of contained anger. My son, always the more reserved one, spoke with a firm voice, although the shock was noticeable. "Dad, we are in shock. We do not know what to say. We are worried about Mom, about her health. We understand that the situation is terrible, but we want her to be okay." I looked at them with gratitude. Their concern for their mother, despite everything, showed me the nobility of their hearts. "I know, children, I also want your mother to recover. But I also need you to understand what this means for me." My daughter nodded, wiping away her tears. "We understand, Dad. It is horrible. We cannot imagine how you feel. But what are you going to do?" I took a deep breath. "I do not know yet, children. I need time to think about it. But I promise you that I will make a decision when your mother is better, more recovered. I do not want this to affect her health now, but I also cannot continue living as if nothing has happened." I offered them a sincere look, seeking their understanding and support. "I need you to know that I love you very much and that whatever happens, you are the most important thing to me, and that any decision I make, I will make it thinking also of you." My children got up and hugged me tightly. "We support you, Dad," my son said firmly. "We are with you in whatever you decide." His words were a balm to my wounded soul. Feeling their support, their understanding, gave me the strength to face what was coming. We decided to go to the hospital together. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was tense. My wife's relatives were already there, in the waiting room, talking in low voices, with looks of concern and reproach. When they saw us enter, the silence became even denser. They greeted my children with some warmth, but they gave me cold and accusing looks. It was evident that the news of the infidelity had spread among them, and that they considered me the culprit of the situation. My children approached them and accompanied them to their mother's room. I lagged behind, feeling the penetrating stares fixed on my back. When the twins entered the room, the volume of the voices rose slightly. I could hear fragments of conversation, reproaches, complaints. It was evident that they were confronting my wife about what had happened. After a few minutes, my children came out of the room. Both had red and swollen eyes from tears. They approached me with distraught faces. "Dad," my daughter began with a choked voice, "Mom's relatives are very angry with you. They have complained to us about how you are behaving. They say you have no heart, that you do not think about Mom." My anger, which had been contained until that moment, began to surface. "So," I replied with a sarcastic and bitter tone, "and what did they expect? That I thank them for the favor their daughter has done me? That I congratulate her for her infidelity and for the attack she suffered?" My son tried to calm things down. "Dad, please, do not get any angrier. We understand you are hurt, but do not make things worse." "Make things worse," I repeated with disbelief. Do they really think things can be worse than they already are? My wife cheats on me, humiliates me, ends up stabbed in a motel, and now I am the bad guy? My voice rose, unable to contain the anger and pain any longer. They should mind their own business. They should not meddle in my marriage. It is none of their business what happens between my wife and me, and they certainly have no right to judge me or tell me how I should behave. My wife's relatives, who had heard my outburst from the end of the hallway, approached with furious faces. One of my brothers-in-law, with a face red with anger, stood in front of me with a threatening attitude. "How dare you talk like that? Can you not see how my sister is suffering? Do you not have a bit of humanity?" "Humanity?" I laughed bitterly. "Humanity is what your sister lacked when she cheated on me. Humanity is what her lover lacked when he stabbed her. Do not come to me now talking about humanity, because you have no idea what I am going through." I looked at them with contempt, with anger, with the pain raw on my skin. "This is my marriage, my life, and you have no right to meddle or to have an opinion. So I ask you to stay out of it, because if you get involved in my affairs, you are going to have serious problems with me. And I am not willing to tolerate disrespect from anyone, much less from you, who think you are morally superior to me." Silence took over the hallway. My brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law looked at me with hatred and fury, but none of them dared to respond. I had put them in their place. I had made it clear that I was not going to let them judge me or tell me how I should feel or act. My pain was mine, my decision was mine, and no one had the right to question it. After the tense confrontation, my wife's relatives retreated to a corner of the waiting room, murmuring among themselves with looks of resentment towards me. My children, visibly affected by the scene, approached me cautiously. After my children came out of the room crying, they approached me with reddened eyes and asked me with a barely audible voice, "Dad, you go in too, please, but do not be so hard on Mom. She is very delicate right now." Their words, although laden with concern for their mother, touched a sensitive chord in me. Despite all the pain and anger, I knew I should not vent my fury on her in her vulnerable state. I nodded in silence and prepared to enter. As I crossed the threshold of the room, I felt a knot in my stomach. Just a few days ago, this was the place where I was consumed with worry for the woman I loved. Now, looking at her in that hospital bed, I only felt disgust. Yes, disgust. That was the word that best described the mixture of repulsion and disappointment that was invading me. An uncomfortable silence spread between us. She looked at me with moist eyes, waiting perhaps for some reaction, some word. I, on the other hand, just sat in a chair next to the bed without saying anything, observing her with a distant coldness. Finally, it was she who broke the silence, and she did it in the most unexpected way, with a trivial question, as if we were having a daily conversation, as if nothing had happened. How are you?" she asked with a thread of a voice, trying to force a smile. "Have you eaten anything?" Her question, so out of place, so alien to the emotional storm that enveloped us, left me dumbfounded. Did she really think we could talk about the weather or dinner after everything that had happened? I looked her straight in the eye and let out the question that was burning inside me, the one that summarized all my pain and my confusion. Why? Upon hearing my question, her facade of normality crumbled. Her eyes filled with tears, and her lower lip began to tremble. It was not my fault," she stammered between sobs. They forced me. Please, understand me. I love you, only you." The tears ran freely down her face as she tried to grab my hand. I remained motionless, without responding, without reciprocating her gesture. Her words, her crying, no longer moved me. The barrier of betrayal had been raised between us, impenetrable and insurmountable. I do not know what I am going to do, I told her finally, with a tired and distant tone. But as long as the twins are here, and as long as you are recovering, I am going to act as if nothing is happening. Upon hearing my words, she seemed to be a little relieved. Thank you. Thank you very much, she whispered, trying to take my hand again. But please, forgive me. She began to beg, to plead for my forgiveness with her voice choked with tears. I gently withdrew my hand, avoiding her contact. Do not stress yourself out anymore now, I told her coldly. You are still weak. Recover. And without saying more, I got up from the chair and left the room, leaving her immersed in her crying and her belated repentance. Upon leaving, my children were waiting for me with anxious looks. I told them simply, if you want to stay, stay. I have things to do. They did not fully understand my attitude, but they did not insist either. As I walked away, I felt the accusing glares of my wife's relatives fixed on my back, but I no longer cared. I had reached a point of absolute indifference to their opinions and judgments. I left the hospital and took out my phone. I needed answers. I needed to fully understand the truth behind this nightmare. I called my lawyer. Do you know any private investigator? I asked him directly. Yes, of course I do, my lawyer replied without hesitation. I will put you in touch with him immediately. Shortly after, I received the investigator's call. I explained the situation. I told him everything I knew and what I needed to find out. I need to know the whole story, I told him with determination. I want to know what really happened. Do not worry, sir, the investigator replied in a professional voice. I will start working on it immediately. At that moment, a small spark of hope, or perhaps just curiosity, ignited within me. I needed the truth, and I was willing to move heaven and earth to find it. The following days slipped by one after another in a kind of emotional fog. I accompanied my children to the hospital. It was the least I could do for them, but I avoided entering my wife's room at all costs. My presence was limited to the waiting room, a space filled with hostile looks from her relatives. I ignored their cutting comments and their accusing silences, absorbed in my own thoughts, in the labyrinth of pain and confusion in which I found myself. I was living on autopilot, fulfilling my work obligations, eating and sleeping by inertia, but without really feeling anything. The world around me seemed blurred, colorless, lifeless. Only the concern for my children and the need to discover the truth kept me minimally anchored to reality. The investigator called me a few days later, summoning me to a cafe downtown. The wait had seemed eternal to me, and the call awakened in me a mixture of anxiety and expectation. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had really happened, who that man was, and how my marriage had reached this point of self-destruction. I arrived at the cafe early, nervous, mentally reviewing the questions I wanted to ask the investigator. When he arrived, punctual and with a leather briefcase in his hand, I noticed in his gaze a seriousness that anticipated that the news would not be good. We sat at a secluded table in a quiet corner of the place. After the formal greetings, the investigator opened his briefcase and took out a thick folder. Sir, he began, his voice grave, I have thoroughly investigated your wife's case, and I am sorry to tell you that the situation is indeed very complicated. My heart sped up. What have you discovered? I asked impatiently, holding my breath. The investigator opened the folder and showed me a series of black and white photographs. Thanks to my contacts in the police, he explained, I have managed to get access to the videotapes from the motel that night. The photographs showed blurry, grainy images, but clear enough to understand what they represented. Here is your wife, the investigator pointed out, indicating a woman in one of the images, entering the motel with a man. They were holding hands, very affectionate, kissing, like a normal couple. I looked at the photos with a churning stomach. Seeing my wife so smiling and affectionate with another man was like a stab in the soul. The betrayal materialized before my eyes in those cold, impersonal images. They entered the room at a certain time. The investigator continued. And then, 2 hours later, this man. He pointed to another photo where a man was seen running out of the motel, with dark stains on his clothes, ran out, visibly bloodied. Shortly after, the motel receptionist entered the room and called the police and emergency services. You know the rest of the story. I looked away from the photographs, feeling nauseous. And who was that man? I asked with a thin voice. The investigator turned the page in the folder. Thanks to your wife's testimony to the police, we were able to identify him. His name is, he consulted a document, fictitious name of the lover, and he is a co-worker of your wife. The information hit me like a sledgehammer. A co-worker? Someone from her daily environment? The betrayal became even closer, more intimate, more repulsive. We investigated further, the investigator continued, and we spoke with several co-workers of both of them. They confirmed that they had been in a relationship for several months. Apparently, they were seen together, although they tried to be discreet. They also told us that they had fights from time to time, especially due to the man's jealousy. They say he is a controlling and aggressive type. The investigator paused and then added with an even graver tone, since the incident, this man has not returned to work. Nobody knows where he is. It seems he has vanished. I remained silent, processing all the information. The raw and merciless truth was unfolding before me like an infernal map. My wife had cheated on me with a co-worker for months, and that extramarital relationship had ended in violence, in a brutal and premeditated attack. Do you have anything else? I asked with a thin voice, although I feared the answer. The investigator nodded slowly. Yes, sir. There is something else. This man, fictitious name of the lover, is also married and has children. The last revelation left me speechless. Not only had my wife cheated on me, but she had also participated in the destruction of another family. The magnitude of the betrayal, the moral baseness of the situation, overwhelmed me. I thanked the detective for his work, paid his fees, and left the cafe, staggering, with the folder full of evidence in my hands and my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I returned home, and there, in the solitude of my study, I sank back into alcohol and tears, drowning my sorrows in the bitterness of the discovered truth. The night would be long and dark. In the solitude of my new apartment, after the stormy night, I woke up with an unusual mental clarity. The folder with the investigator's evidence was no longer just a testimony of pain, but the map to my vindication. The betrayal would not go unpunished. I would not seek physical violence. That was not in my nature, but justice, in my own way, would be served. With a steely determination, I went to my lawyer's office. I reiterated my decision for a divorce, but this time with a different nuance. It was no longer just a personal need, but an act of justice. I asked him to speed up the proceedings as much as possible and to prepare a relentless legal strategy. This time there would be no concessions. The following weeks, while my ex-wife was recovering physically in the hospital, I built my silent and legal revenge. Each visit to the hospital became a calculated act, a necessary farce to not raise premature suspicions and to protect my children. I kept the conversations trivial, the mask of a worried husband, while inside I was brewing my plan. I watched my ex-wife. I listened to her pleas for forgiveness with a studied impassiveness, savoring internally the moment when the truth and justice would be revealed. Parallel to the divorce process, I contacted a labor lawyer, an expert in cases of unfair competition and damage to corporate image. With the evidence in hand, especially the photos from the motel and the testimonies of the colleagues, we prepared a lawsuit against my ex-wife's company and against her lover, demanding substantial financial compensation for the damages caused. It was not just about my personal pain, but also about the reputational damage that their clandestine relationship had generated in the professional sphere of both. On the day of my ex-wife's discharge, I picked her up with the same distant formality of the last few weeks. On the way home, I avoided any personal conversation, limiting myself to superficial comments about her physical recovery. Upon arriving, my children, unaware of the legal storm that was brewing, tried to create a peaceful family atmosphere. I allowed them that illusion for a few days, knowing that soon the truth would come to light, but I wanted to protect them from direct confrontation at the most heated moment of the conflict. Once my children returned to college, I summoned my ex-wife for a definitive conversation in the study, now completely empty, a palpable symbol of my irreversible departure. When she entered, with hope still shining in her eyes, I took out the documents, the photos from the motel, the detective's report, the divorce papers, and a new, bulky, and official envelope. "What is this?" she asked with a trembling voice, pointing to the last envelope. "Justice." I replied with a gelid calm that completely disarmed her. These are the documents of the lawsuit I have filed against you and against your partner for moral damages, economic damages, and damage to image. Her face contorted. The crying and pleas for forgiveness transformed into disbelief and rage. You are going to sue me after everything I have suffered, after being on the verge of death? Precisely, I replied with a bitter smile. After everything you have made me suffer, and after putting your life at risk for a miserable affair. Your actions have consequences, and now you are going to face them. She tried to negotiate, threaten, emotionally manipulate me, but I stood firm, immovable. I made it clear to her that the divorce was inevitable and that the lawsuit would follow its course. Do not expect a single cent from me in the divorce, I told her forcefully. And prepare yourselves, you and your lover, to assume the economic and professional consequences of your actions. I left the study, leaving her desolate and furious, and closed the door on a dark chapter of my life. The calls and messages from her relatives continued, now loaded with insults and threats, but they no longer affected me. I had regained control of my life, and justice, although late, was beginning to take shape. The divorce process was long and contentious, as she wished, but the labor lawsuit was advancing solidly, backed by irrefutable evidence. In each hearing, in each meeting with her lawyer, I maintained the same coldness and determination. I was not seeking personal revenge, but a fair reparation and an exemplary punishment for those who had betrayed and humiliated me. Finally, the judge ruled the divorce on my terms, with no concessions for my ex-wife. And the sentence of the labor lawsuit was even more satisfactory. My ex-wife's company, pressured by the negative publicity and the evidence presented, agreed to a substantial financial compensation, both for me and for the company affected by the lover's actions. The lover, for his part, in addition to being criminally prosecuted for the assault, was condemned to pay a considerable sum of money for damages. I had a final conversation with my ex-wife, already in the courts, after the signing of the divorce. Her face reflected bitterness and defeat. She reiterated once more her regret and her love. I looked at her with indifference, feeling a cold satisfaction at seeing her reap the consequences of her actions. True love does not betray, does not deceive, does not destroy, I told her with a firm voice. This is the result of your choices. Now live with them. I left the courts with the feeling of having closed a vicious circle. Justice, although cold and legal, had arrived. I did not feel joy or jubilation, but a deep inner peace, the satisfaction of having defended my dignity and of having obtained a fair reparation for the damage caused. In my apartment, I started a new chapter. I resumed my hobbies, reconnected with old friends, enjoyed the company of my children, who celebrated my strength and my decision to rebuild my life. I learned through them that my ex-wife's lover was serving his sentence and was also facing the consequences of his actions in his own family. I also learned that my ex-wife had lost her job and was struggling with depression, but that part of her story no longer belonged to me. I looked to the future with hope, with the certainty that I had overcome a painful trial and that I had emerged from it stronger and wiser. Justice, in the end, had had a bitter taste, but also a strangely satisfying one. The taste of vindication, of recovered dignity, and of the beginning of a new and promising dawn.